I married a man I'd known for 11 days. He was in a wheelchair. He barely looked at me when we signed the papers. And when the clerk at the Baltimore City Courthouse said, "You may kiss the bride," he just looked at her flatly and said, "That won't be necessary." Everyone told me I'd lost my mind. My mother cried for 2 days straight. My best friend stopped returning my calls for a week. The girls I went to med school with, the ones who were already posting engagement photos and bridal shower invites, they heard what I did and went quiet in that particular way. People go quiet when they don't want to say what they're actually thinking. What nobody knew, including me, was that I had just accidentally married one of the most powerful men on the East Coast. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Where are you watching from right now? Seriously? Drop it in the comments. I want to know who's here with me for this, because this story, this one right here, is the one I've been trying to figure out how to tell for almost 2 years. Stay with me. I promise it's worth it. My name is Zara Collins, and I grew up in West Baltimore in a row house with my mother, my grandmother, and a radiator that only worked when it felt like it. We were not poor in the way that makes people stop functioning. We were poor in the quiet, managed way, where you learn early which things are worth wanting and which things are just going to cost you more than you have. My mother worked nights at a hospital for 22 years, not as a doctor, as an aide, changing sheets and taking vitals and doing the work that keeps everything running while the people with degrees get the credit. I decided when I was 9 years old that I was going to be a neurosurgeon. Not because it was practical, not because anyone in my family had done anything close to it. I decided because I was 9 years old and I saw a documentary about the human brain on television and something inside me went completely still and certain in a way nothing ever had before. The brain, the way it holds everything, memory, movement, language, love, all of it sitting inside a skull, protected and fragile at the same time. I wanted to understand it. I wanted to fix it when it broke. My mother didn't laugh at me. She didn't tell me to be realistic. She just looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Then you better start working." And I did. I worked for 18 years. Scholarships, loans, every night shift, and weekend job and study session that stretched past 3 in the morning. I got into Johns Hopkins for medical school, which still feels like something that happened to a different person when I say it out loud. I matched into a neurosurgery residency program that accepted 6 people out of 400 applicants nationwide. I was one of 6. I had done exactly what I said I was going to do when I was 9 years old sitting in front of that television. And then, 14 months into my residency, I slipped on a wet floor in the break room at 2 in the morning. It sounds almost too small to matter. A wet floor, a bad step, the kind of thing that happens every day and means nothing. But I went down hard. My right arm caught the edge of a supply cart, and I felt something in my hand give in a way that I knew immediately, with the cold clarity that medical training gives you, was not good. The MRI showed partial tears in 2 of the flexor tendons in my right hand, my dominant hand, the hand I needed to hold a scalpel. The attending who reviewed my results, a man I had worked alongside for over a year, a man I respected, sat across from me in a small office and told me that with proper rest, physical therapy, and time, I would likely regain full function. Likely. That word sat in the room like a stone. He said the timeline was uncertain. He said I would need to take a leave from surgical rotations. He said we would reassess in 6 months. 6 months. In residency time, that is an eternity. In neurosurgery residency time, it is the difference between keeping up and falling so far behind that you may never catch up. I drove home that night, 38 minutes on 83 South, which I have driven so many times I can do it without thinking, and I did not cry. I didn't have the energy to cry. I just sat in the parking lot of my apartment building with my hands in my lap and looked at my right hand like it had betrayed me personally, like it had made a choice. That was a Thursday. On Saturday, Elijah Monroe told me he was leaving. Elijah and I had been together for 3 years. He was finishing his MBA at University of Maryland, smart and ambitious, and built like someone who took the gym seriously, which he did. We had met at a mutual friend's cookout in Fells Point, and he had made me laugh 3 times in the first 10 minutes, which I took as a sign. We talked about the future the way young couples do when they're still in the part where the future seems like a place you can plan your way into, where we would live, what kind of life we would build, whether we wanted it kids and when. He came over Saturday morning with coffee from the place on Charles Street that I liked. He set the cups down on my kitchen counter and then he stood there with his hands in his pockets and that specific look on his face that I had seen once before, when he had to tell me his father was sick, and I knew before he opened his mouth that whatever was coming next was going to cost me something. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking. He said the injury changed things, not because he didn't care about me, but because he had to be honest about the life he was building and what he needed in a partner. He said he needed someone who was present, someone whose future was stable and certain, and right now, mine was neither of those things. He said he had met someone. He paused there, like he was deciding how much to give me, and then he gave me all of it. Her name was Jade. She came from money. Her family had connection in finance that could help him. He said it wasn't about the money, but the way he said it made clear that it was, at least partly, about the money. I didn't say anything. I let him finish. I had learned somewhere along the way that giving people enough rope to fully hang themselves with their own words is a form of dignity. Yours, not theirs. When he was done, I picked up one of the coffees from the counter, took a sip, and said, "You should go." He looked almost disappointed that I hadn't fallen apart, like he had prepared for a scene and I had declined to perform in it. "Zara, I said you should go, Elijah." He went. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after that. The coffee was good. I drank both cups, and then I sat down on my kitchen floor, not dramatically, not collapsing, just sitting. And I let myself be in the full weight of what the past 72 hours had deposited on me. A hand that might not heal the way it needed to, a residency that was slipping, 3 years of a relationship gone in the length of time it took to drink a cup of coffee. I am not a person who stays on the floor. That is something my grandmother drilled into me so early it operates below conscious thought. You sit with the hard thing, and then you get up. So I sat with it, and then I got up. But I won't lie to you and say I wasn't scared. I was scared in a way I hadn't been since I was a kid, when scared was just the natural weather of being young and broke and uncertain about everything. I had worked so hard to get out from under that particular feeling. And here it was again, sitting in my clean apartment in my good neighborhood, with my medical degree on the wall, feeling exactly like that 9-year-old girl who wasn't sure which things she was allowed to want. I met Marcus Reed 12 days after Elijah left. I was at Johns Hopkins for a follow-up appointment on my hand, a Tuesday afternoon in October, the kind of October day in Baltimore that can't decide if it wants to be fall or summer, and ends up being both at once. The waiting area outside the hand surgery clinic was half full. I sat down with a paper coffee cup and a journal article I was trying to focus on, and I noticed him because he was the only other person in the room not looking at a phone. He was in a wheelchair, a manual chair, well-maintained, nothing institutional about it. Dark jeans, a plain gray pullover, a face that would have been handsome if it wasn't working so hard at being unreadable. He had a manila folder open across his lap, and he was reading whatever was inside it with the same flat concentration I recognized from the tendings, reviewing charts. Not reading for interest, reading for information he was going to act on. He glanced up once, registered me the way you register furniture, and looked back at his folder. I looked back at my journal article. About 10 minutes passed before I heard him exhale. The specific exhale of someone who has just read something they already knew and didn't want confirmed. I glanced over without meaning to. He caught me looking. "Sorry," I said, because I had been raised to apologize for staring even when I wasn't technically staring. He looked at me for a moment, not unkindly, just assessing, the way some people do before they decide whether a conversation is worth the energy. Then he said, "What happened to your hand?" I looked down at the brace on my right hand. Residency accident, tendon damage, neurosurgery. I looked at him more carefully then. Most people, when they heard I was a resident, said, "Oh, good for you," or asked how many years it took. They didn't guess the specialty. "How did you know?" "The journal." He nodded toward what I was holding. "Journal of Neurosurgical Technique." "Most people don't read that for fun." "Most people are missing out," I said. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the place a smile comes from. "How bad is the damage?" "Uncertain prognosis. I'm on leave from surgical rotations until further notice, and that's a problem." "That's a significant problem," I said. He nodded once, like he was filing the information somewhere. Then he went back to his folder. I went back to my article. But the waiting room had changed slightly, had the quality of a space where two people are now aware of each other in a way they weren't before. When the nurse called his name, Mr. Reed, he closed the folder, maneuvered his chair with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing it long enough to stop thinking about it, and that was that. I didn't think about him again until 3 days later, when I opened my apartment door at 7 in the evening to find him on the other side of it. I want to tell you what that moment felt like because I think it matters. It wasn't frightening, though it probably should have been a stranger at my door who I had spoken to for a total of maybe 6 minutes. It was more disorienting than frightening, like a thing from one part of your life appearing in a different part where it has no logical reason to be. How do you know where I live? I said. I asked someone who knew someone, he said, which was not actually an answer. I need to talk to you. Can I come in? I should have said no. My mother would have wanted me to say no. Every reasonable instinct in my body was generating a version of no. But there was something about the way he said it, not demanding, not charming, not performing any of the things men perform when they want something from a woman, that made me step back from the door. He came in, looked at my apartment in the way. He looked at everything, which was straight at it without any particular expression. I had not cleaned that day, and I considered apologizing for that too, and then decided against it. He went straight to what he had come for. I know about Dr. Okafor's program, he said, the Advanced Neurosurgery Fellowship at Hopkins. I know you applied and were rejected last cycle because of your hand. And I know applications for the next cycle open in 3 weeks. I was very still. How do you know that? I know a number of things that I'm not going to explain right now. What I want to know is whether you still want it. Of course I still want it. Then here's what I'm proposing. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket. He was dressed better than Tuesday, I noticed, though still with no particular display about it, and set an envelope on my kitchen table. Marry me. 6 months. You take care of me. Keep our arrangement private, and I will ensure that your application to Okafor's program is successful. After 6 months, we dissolve the arrangement quietly and go our separate ways. You get your career, I get what I need. I stared at the envelope, then at him. What do you need? A wife, he said. For reasons I'll explain at a later time. That's not good enough. No, he agreed. It isn't. Open the envelope. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, letterhead I recognized immediately, an acceptance letter from Professor James Okafor's fellowship program at Johns Hopkins, dated 2 days ago. My name at the top. My heart did something complicated. This isn't real. It will be, if you agree. And if I don't, then it isn't, and I go. He said it without heat, without pressure, like a man presenting a business arrangement who had already calculated for every possible outcome and was comfortable with all of them. I set the letter down, picked it up again, set it down. I don't know you, I said. You know enough, he said. You know I'm not asking you to do anything illegal or dangerous. You know the terms are finite. You know what you're getting in return. I don't know why you need this. Not yet, he said, but you will. I looked at him for a long time. He held the eye contact without flinching, without performing confidence, without doing any of the things people do when they're trying to convince you of something. He just waited. That was the thing I kept coming back to afterward. He just waited, like he had time and he was willing to give me mine. I thought about my hand. I thought about the waiting room and the 6 residents who were still on surgical rotation, while I was sitting at home reading journals I couldn't act on. I thought about Elijah standing in my kitchen telling me my future was too uncertain and his needed to be stable. I thought about being 9 years old and knowing with complete certainty what I was supposed to do with my life. I thought about my mother, who had worked nights for 22 years so that I could have options. 6 months, I said. 6 months. And you tell me the rest of it. Not now, apparently, but at some point, you tell me what this is actually about. He looked at me, a beat, agreed. And I have my own room, obviously. And you don't talk to me like I work for you. Something moved in his face again. That place the smile comes from, but more complicated this time. I'll try, he said. It was not the most reassuring thing anyone had ever said to me. But it was honest, and right then honest was the thing I needed most. My mother, when I told her, did not cry right away. She went very quiet first, which was worse. Then she said, Zara Collins, what is wrong with you? Mama, you don't know this man. You don't know his family. You don't know his situation. You don't know why he needs a wife so bad he'd knock on a stranger's door with a letter from John Hopkins. She paused. How do you even know that letter is real? I called the program office. I said, "It's real." She went quiet again. "It's 6 months," I said. "It's my career. It's the one thing I have been working towards since I was 9 years old, Mama. And right now, someone is offering it to me at a price I can afford." I heard her breathing on the other end of the phone. I knew she was sitting at her kitchen table, the same table we'd eaten every meal at my entire childhood. And I knew the exact expression on her face, and I hated being the cause of it. "He's disabled?" she said finally. "He uses a wheelchair, yes. And he's not your type of person. I don't know what type of person he is yet." That, my mother said, is my point. She didn't approve. She made that very clear. But she also didn't tell me not to do it, because my mother is a woman who has made hard choices her entire life, and she was not going to be a hypocrite about mine. What she did say before we hung up was, "S, you call me every 3 days, you hear me? Every 3 days you call me and you tell me you're okay. And if you're not okay, you say the word and I will come get you." "I know, Mama. I love you. I love you too." We were married on a Thursday morning at the Baltimore City Courthouse, 11 days after Marcus Reed knocked on my door. I wore a dark green dress I already owned and a pair of low heels that I now associate entirely with that day. Marcus wore a charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive suits fit. Not like clothing, but like an extension of the person wearing it. Victor, his assistant, stood to one side in a dark coat and witnessed the paperwork with the expression of a man who had seen many things and had made peace with all of them. The clerk was a small woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain who had clearly married several thousand people and had no opinion about any of us. She read the relevant portions of the ceremony in a tone that suggested she was reading a grocery list. And when she reached the part about kissing, Marcus said what he said, and the clerk blinked once and stamped the certificate, and we were done. In the car afterward, Marcus in the back, me beside him, Victor driving north on St. Paul. Nobody said anything for about 6 blocks. Then Marcus said without looking at me, "Are you hungry?" I realized I had not eaten since 5 that morning. "Yes," I said. He told Victor a restaurant name, and we went there and ate at a corner table in relative silence. And it was somehow less awkward than I expected. Not comfortable, not anything close to comfortable, but functional. Like two people who had agreed on the terms of a project and were now at the beginning of executing it. It was only later, when Victor pulled up to the building on Charles Street, a high rise with a doorman in a lobby, that told me immediately that this was not the kind of building my Hopkins stipend had any business living in. That the reality of what I had done began to settle into my body like weather changing. The penthouse was on the 14th floor. I stood in the entrance with my single rolling suitcase and looked at floor-to-ceiling windows and a kitchen that had more counter space than my entire previous apartment, and I thought quietly and very specifically, who is this man? Marcus came in behind me, moved his chair to the window, and looked out at the city in a way that made clear he had looked at this view many times and it was not new to him. "Your room is down the hall on the left," he said. "There's a key on the counter. Groceries are delivered Tuesdays and Friday. If you need anything specific, leave a note for Victor." He paused. "I prefer to eat at 7. I don't expect anything elaborate." "Anything else?" I said. He turned to look at me then, fully, in a way he hadn't done since the courthouse. His eyes were the kind of dark that takes a moment to read in low light. "You cook?" he said. "You don't ask questions about my business. You don't go through my office." A pause. "That's the deal." I held his gaze. "Understood." He nodded and turned his chair toward the hallway on the right. I picked up my suitcase, walked toward the room on the left, and then, because I was almost at the door and something made me stop, I turned back. On the kitchen island, where Marcus had set his jacket, his phone was lit up with a notification. I could see it from where I stood. I wasn't trying to read it. But the font was large and the name at the top was not a person's name. It said, "Read Capital, Emergency Board Session Requested." I looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then I walked into my room and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time, listening to the sounds of the building settling around me. The low hum of a city at night, the distant sound of traffic 14 floors below, the muffled sounds of Marcus moving through the apartment on the other side of the wall. Reed Capital. I had heard that name. I was almost certain I had heard that name. I lay back on the bed with my right hand resting on my stomach. feeling the faint ache in my tendons that had not left since October. And I stared at the ceiling of a room I did not know in an apartment I did not own next to a man I had married without understanding. And I thought about the 9-year-old girl who had decided she knew exactly what she wanted. Baby, my grandmother's voice said somewhere in the back of my mind. You don't always get to see the whole road. Sometimes you just have to walk. I closed my eyes. Outside, Baltimore went on being Baltimore. Loud and complicated and completely indifferent to whatever had just changed in my life. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would figure out what Reed Capital was. Tonight, I just had to breathe. The thing about living with a stranger is that you learn them in the wrong order. With most people, you get the surface first. The smile, the small talk, the curated version they hand you before they decide you're worth the rest. With Marcus Reed, I got none of that. I got the back of his head. I got the sound of his voice through a wall at 11 at night, low and deliberate, talking to someone about things I didn't understand. I got the smell of coffee already made when I came out of my room at 6 in the morning, which meant he had been awake before me, which meant he either didn't sleep much or didn't sleep at all. I got the shape of a person before I got the person. And somewhere in that backward learning, without planning to and without permission from the part of my brain that was supposed to be keeping track of arrangements and terms and 6-month timelines, I started paying attention in a way that had nothing to do with the deal. Reed Capital. I looked it up the morning after we moved in, sitting cross-legged on my bed with my laptop open. Before the sun had fully cleared the buildings outside my window, what I found stopped me mid-scroll. Reed Capital Group, founded 1987 by Harold Reed, a black entrepreneur from Philadelphia who had started with one apartment building in West Philly and built it into a real estate and private investment empire that now held assets across 12 states. Harold Reed had died 4 years ago, leaving the company to his eldest son. The articles from that period, the obituaries, the business profiles, the transition announcements, all named the same person as Harold's successor and new CEO, Marcus Reed. And then, about 18 months after those articles, a different kind of coverage. Quieter, less visible. The kind of stories that appear in business trade publications that most people never read. Brief mentions of a leadership transition at Reed Capital. A note that Devin Reed, younger son of Harold Reed, had assumed operational control following his brother's medical leave. No details, no explanation, just the clean, sanitized language of a press release written by someone whose job was to make a significant change look like an unremarkable one. I sat with my laptop and read everything twice, then I closed it, got dressed, and went to make breakfast. Marcus was already in the kitchen when I came out. He was at the island with a tablet propped against a fruit bowl, reading something with the same focused attention he brought to everything. He glanced up when I came in, registered me, looked back at his screen. I opened the refrigerator, stared into it for a moment without seeing anything. "There's eggs," he said without looking up. "Second shelf." "I can see that," I said. "You've been standing there for 40 seconds. I pulled out the eggs. I was thinking. About what? I cracked 2 eggs into a bowl and decided, in the time it took to do that I was not going to ask him about Reed Capital that morning. Not because I was afraid to, because I had agreed to let him tell me in his own time, and I was a person who kept her word. About whether I can make a decent omelet with my left hand, I said instead. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite the smile, but close. "Can you?" "We're about to find out." It was a mediocre omelet. He ate all of it. That was how our mornings began. Not warmly. Warmth takes time, and neither of us had agreed to time, only to 6 months, but functionally, with a certain economy of communication that I came to appreciate more than I expected to. Marcus was not a man who filled silence with noise. He didn't ask me questions about my day or comment on things that didn't require comment. In a previous life, I might have called that cold. In the context of what we were, 2 people in an arrangement, nothing more. It felt honest, like we were both being exactly what we had agreed to be, nothing performed and nothing borrowed from a script that didn't belong to us. I cooked most evenings, not because the deal required elaborate meals. He had said specifically that it didn't. But because cooking was the thing I had done since I was 12 years old to make whatever space I was in feel like mine. In the row house on Gilmer Street, I had taken over the kitchen by necessity when my grandmother's arthritis got bad, and I had never stopped. Standing at a stove was where I thought clearly. It was where my brain slowed down to a speed I could work with. The first week, Marcus never said anything about the food. He ate. He said thank you once, on Thursday, in the tone of someone completing a required administrative task. I didn't take it personally. The second week, he ate the jerk chicken I made on a Tuesday and then sat at the island for a moment longer than usual before taking his plate to the sink. I was at the counter with my back to him and I heard him stop. Then I heard him continue to the sink. I turned around and the plate was rinsed and he was already moving his chair toward the hallway. Marcus, he stopped. Was it okay? A pause. It was good, he said. Not it was fine. Not the administrative thank you. It was good. And then he kept going. I stood in the kitchen and held that small thing carefully, the way you hold something you're not sure yet how fragile it is. The milk and honey happened by accident. I have a thing about warm drinks at night. It started in college when I was surviving on 4 hours of sleep and needed something to signal to my body that the day was actually ending. Warm milk, a spoon of honey, sometimes a little cinnamon if I had it. I made it every night in the penthouse kitchen before I went to bed, more from habit than intention. One night, about 3 weeks in, I made 2 cups. I don't know why. My hands just did it. I stood at the counter looking at both cups and thought about the fact that I had heard Marcus's lamp still on at 11:30, which meant he was still working, which he always was. I set 1 cup outside his door, knocked once, lightly, so he would know it was there. Then I went to my room. I didn't say anything about it the next morning. He didn't either. But when I came out at 6, both cups were on the drying rack, rinsed, placed carefully. After that, I made 2 every night. He never asked me to. We never discussed it. It just became the thing that happened. A small ritual with no name, belonging to no category of relationship either of us had agreed to be in. I want to tell you about the morning I figured out what I was actually dealing with. It was a Wednesday, 5 weeks into our arrangement. Victor had come by early. He had a key and a standing habit of appearing with folders and a coffee from the place on Reed Street that Marcus liked. And the two of them were in the office at the back of the apartment. The door was not fully closed. I was not trying to listen. I was in the kitchen with my physical therapy resistance band doing the finger extension exercises my PT had given me, which require focus, but not enough focus to block out sound when a voice carries. Marcus's voice carried. I had heard him on the phone before through walls, the low, steady register of a man accustomed to being listened to. But that morning, with the door cracked and the apartment quiet, I heard something different. I heard him the way I imagined people heard him before the wheelchair. Certain and cold and containing a kind of authority that had nothing differential in it, nothing accommodating, nothing of the blank-faced man who ate my omelets without comment. Pull the Meridian accounts, all 3, and tell Hargrove that if he wants to keep his seat on that board, he'll remember which Reed put him there. Pause, Victor's voice lower and harder to catch. Then Marcus, Devin doesn't know about the Meridian connection. Keep it that way. When we move once and we don't miss. I stopped doing my exercises. I stood very still in the kitchen and listened to the silence that followed, and then to the sound of Victor leaving, and then to the sound of the office door closing fully. When Marcus came out 20 minutes later, his face was the usual face. Level, unreadable, caring nothing of the conversation I had heard. He looked at me standing at the counter and said, "How's the hand?" "Better," I said, "little by little." He nodded and went to get his coffee. I looked at his back and thought, Devin Reed, his brother. And then I thought about the articles I had read and the year and a half of quiet coverage and the word medical leave used like a curtain being drawn across a window. I thought about the way he had said when we move once and we don't miss. Whatever was happening in this apartment, it was not a man on leave. It was a man preparing. Professor Okafor came on a Thursday afternoon in our 6th week. I had been working with him remotely for a month. Video sessions, written case analyses, the theoretical and diagnostic components of the fellowship that didn't require my hands to be at full capacity. But the program required in-person assessments, and my PT had cleared me for limited supervised practice. So Okafor came to the apartment with a kit bag in a calm, unhurried manner, and the particular energy of a man who had been doing important work for 30 years and saw no reason to be dramatic about it. He was in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, with reading glasses he pushed up his forehead when he was thinking and back down his nose when he was working. He had trained at the Mayo Clinic and done a fellowship in London and had a published body of work in pediatric neurosurgery that I had been reading since I was a second-year medical student. Sitting across from him at my own kitchen table while he reviewed my hand function assessments felt like something that belonged in a different life than the one I was currently navigating. He held my right hand in both of his, examining, pressing gently along the tendon lines, asking me to perform small movements and watching how I did them. His touch was entirely clinical. It was, as I had told Marcus when this became relevant, what it was: a doctor examining a patient's hand. Marcus came out of the hallway about 40 minutes into the session. I felt the temperature of the room change before I saw his face. It was not dramatic. Nothing Marcus did was dramatic, but there was a quality to his stillness when he appeared in the kitchen doorway that I had learned over 6 weeks to read. The stillness that meant something was happening under the surface that was not going to show on the outside. He looked at Okafor's hands holding mine. Okafor looked up, professional and untroubled. "Mr. Reed, I'm Dr. Okafor. I'm working with your wife on her fellowship requirements." "I know who you are," Marcus said. His voice was even. Everything about him was even. "I didn't know you were coming today." "I should have left it on the calendar," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "I forgot." A beat. Marcus looked at me, then at Okafor. Then he said, "I'll be in my office." And he turned his chair and went. Okafor watched him go with the mild curiosity of a man who has observed many things and categorizes them without judgment. Then he looked back at my hand. "Flexion is better. Another 4 to 6 weeks and we'll talk about supervised OR time." After he left, I stood at the kitchen sink and ran cold water over my wrists for a moment, a habit from residency when I needed to reset, and thought about what I had seen on Marcus's face. Not anger, not the cold authority of the man on the phone with Victor. Something else, something that required more words than I had for it at that particular moment. That evening, Victor arrived later than usual. I was in the living room with a journal when he came through and headed toward Marcus's office. I heard their voices briefly, and then Victor came back through the main hallway and paused near the door. "Mrs. Reed." I had not gotten used to being called that. "Zara is fine." Victor had a face built for neutrality, the kind of face that had learned to give away nothing as a professional requirement. But he looked at me for a moment with something that was almost consideration. "He doesn't trust easily," he said. "He hasn't trusted anyone in 3 years, not since—" He stopped. "I just think that's worth knowing." He left before I could ask him to finish the sentence. I sat with the journal open in my lap and didn't read a single word of it. 3 years. The accident had been 3 years ago, according to what little I'd found. 3 years of Devon at the head of Reed Capital. 3 years of whatever the wheelchair had cost Marcus beyond the physical. And watching him in that kitchen doorway, watching the thing move under the surface of his face when he saw Okafor's hands on mine, I was beginning to understand that the physical was not the most expensive part. I want to tell you about the night Elijah and Jade showed up. Not at the apartment. At a hospital benefit dinner that I attended with Marcus 6 weeks into our arrangement. It was a fundraiser for Johns Hopkins Pediatrics. The kind of event where the tickets cost more than my monthly student loan payment, and everyone in the room is performing some version of themselves that's 2 degrees more polished than their actual self. Marcus had been invited as a donor. I came as his wife. I wore a dress I had bought specifically for the occasion, dark burgundy, the kind of thing I would never have bought on a residence stipend, but Marcus had set up a household account that I was still figuring out the etiquette of. And when I came out of my room, Marcus was already by the elevator in a dark suit that cost what suits cost when you're Marcus Reed. And he looked at me for exactly 2 seconds and said, "You look fine." And I decided that from him, fine was probably the equivalent of a standing ovation. We were an hour into the event when I saw them. Elijah first, taller than the men around him, laughing at something with the easy confidence of a man in his element. And then Jade beside him, in a gold dress that knew exactly what it was doing, her hand on his arm with a proprietary ease that told you everything about how long they had been together and how comfortable she had gotten in that position. She saw me before he did. Her eyes moved from me to Marcus, in his chair beside me, and something happened on her face that she didn't bother to fully conceal. Not cruelty. Exactly. The particular expression of someone who has decided the comparison reflects well on them. She excused herself from Elijah's side and came over. "Zara." The hug was the kind that doesn't actually make contact. I didn't know you'd be here. Hi, Jade. Her eyes went to Marcus again, one of those assessments that pretended to be a glance. And this must be my husband, I said. Marcus. Marcus looked at her with his usual level attention and said nothing, not rudely. He simply waited, the way a person waits who has decided that conversation is earned rather than automatic. Jade's smile held. It's so great that Zara has support, she said, to Marcus, as though I weren't standing right there, especially right now with everything she's going through with her hand. It must be such a hard time. Zara seems to be managing well, Marcus said. His voice was entirely neutral. She's been accepted to Okafor's fellowship program. Jade blinked. That one landed somewhere. That's a beat. That's wonderful. The words had the shape of generosity and the substance of nothing. Elijah appeared at her shoulder then. He registered me with the particular look of a man who has moved on and wants to be credited for how gracefully he's done it. Zara, hey. Hey, Elijah. A beat of the specific awkward silence that exists between people who have shared a bed and now share nothing except a mutual awareness of that fact. Then Marcus said in exactly the tone of a man who had somewhere more important to be, Elijah, it was good to meet you. He had not shaken his hand. He had not actually met him. But the dismissal was so clean that Elijah almost thanked him for it. We moved away toward the other side of the room. I kept my face neutral until I was sure we were out of eye line. You didn't have to do that, I said quietly. I know, Marcus said. Then why? Because he left you when it was inconvenient, Marcus said, without heat, without drama, and he wanted you to know he didn't regret it. I didn't want you to have to stand there and absorb that alone. I looked at him. He looked forward at the room with his usual unreadable expression. I didn't say anything. There was something happening in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet, and I wasn't ready to look at it directly. So I looked at the room too, and we stood there together in the particular silence that follows something true, being said out loud between two people who haven't yet figured out what it means. When we got home that night, I made the milk and honey and left his cup outside the door without knocking. Through the wood, I heard him say, "Thank you." I went to bed. Devon Reed arrived on a Tuesday afternoon 3 days later. I was at the kitchen table with my laptop and a stack of case files from Okafor's program when I heard the elevator open and then the knock at the door. Victor was not there. Marcus was in his office. I answered. The man in the doorway was shorter than Marcus, lighter through the shoulders, with a face that had the Reed bone structure but wore it differently, arranged into an expression of easy approachability that I recognized immediately as the kind of smile that is constructed specifically to disarm. He was in a suit that was slightly too perfect, the kind of perfect that announces itself. You must be Zara, he said, like we were old friends and this was a reunion. And you're Devon, I said. Something behind his eyes adjusted, the smallest recalibration, a person noting that you arrived without the script he expected. Marcus mentioned me. Marcus hasn't told me much about anything, I said, but I read. He came in without being invited, which told me everything I needed to know about how he had navigated spaces his whole life. He looked around the apartment with the eyes of someone who had been here before and was taking inventory of what had changed. Nice to finally see someone taking care of this place, he said, and of him. He said it warmly, but the warmth was a costume. My brother needs someone. He's been so isolated since the accident. He seems fine to me, I said. Does he? Devon turned to look at me, and the costume slipped a fraction. Enough for me to see what was under it, not malice exactly. Something colder and more calculating than malice. Assessment. He was figuring out what I knew, what I didn't, and what I could be used for. That's good. That's really good. He paused. You're a doctor, right? Neurosurgery? Resident, fellowship student. Smart woman. The smile again. Smart enough to understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is recognize when a situation isn't healthy. For either of you. I looked at him for a long moment. What exactly are you suggesting, Devon? He spread his hands, reasonable, open, nothing to hide. I'm just saying that Marcus has a complicated history, a lot of bitterness. It affects the people around him. A pause. I worry about him, and now I worry about you. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway. The room changed. Not loudly, It was a quiet change, the kind that happens when two people enter a space who have a history that occupies more square footage than the room itself. Devin turned toward his brother with the same easy smile, not missing a beat. Marcus, I was just getting to know your wife. I can see that, Marcus said. His voice was the voice from the phone call, the one I had heard through the cracked office door, cold and final and containing absolutely no version of welcome. What do you want? Can't I check on family? No. Devin's smile held for 3 more seconds. I counted, and then it shifted into something else. Not anger, something adjacent to respect, in the way that predators sometimes respect the animals that don't run. I heard about the board inquiry, he said. I want you to know that whatever you think happened, there are two sides to Devin. Marcus said his name the way you say a period at the end of a sentence. Just that, nothing more. Devin straightened his jacket, looked at me one more time, and what I saw in that look made the small hairs on my arms stand up. Because it wasn't threatening and it wasn't friendly, and it was specifically designed to let me know that he had cataloged me and would return to me at a more convenient time. Nice to meet you, Zara, he said. He let himself out the same way he had let himself in. The elevator closed. The apartment settled back into its usual sounds. I was still standing in the same spot, and I realized my hand, my right hand, the injured one, was pressed flat against the kitchen table, and I had been pressing down without knowing it, like I was trying to stay in place. Marcus was looking at me from the doorway. Are you all right? He said. The question surprised me. Not the words, but the way he said them. The same words he had asked before, on the bad night after the event, but with something different underneath them now, something less administrative. I'm fine, I said. Then I said, he's dangerous. Yes, Marcus said, simply, without drama, like I had confirmed something he already knew. Has he always been? A pause. He got worse when he had more to protect. I absorbed that, looked down at my hand on the table. Marcus, I looked up. The accident 3 years ago. He held my gaze. Was it Devin? The silence lasted long enough that I had my answer before he gave it. I'll tell you everything, he said. Soon. You said that before. I mean it this time. I believed him. I'm not entirely sure why. He had not given me enough history to earn that belief on its own merits. But I believed him the same way I had believed him 11 days into knowing him, standing at my apartment door with an envelope and no explanation because he wasn't performing. He was just standing there being exactly what he was, as much of it as he was ready to show. And something in me had decided early that was worth more than a polished presentation of something easier. I nodded, went back to my laptop. He went back to his office. That night I made the milk and honey and stood at his door for a moment before setting the cup down. Through the door, I could hear the faint sound of typing, steady, purposeful, the rhythm of a man dismantling something one careful piece at a time. I set the cup down and went to bed. And I lay there in the dark of a room that had started to feel against all planning like mine. And I thought about Devin Reed's eyes as he left, and the way Marcus had said yes to my question about the accident, and the folder that I had not yet seen, but somehow already knew was there, somewhere in that office behind a closed door, containing a truth that was going to cost someone something significant when it finally came out. I didn't know yet that I was going to be the one to find it. I didn't know yet that finding it was going to change everything. I just lay there and listened to the city outside the window and the faint sound of Marcus working on the other side of the wall. And somewhere between one breath and the next, I stopped counting the weeks left in our arrangement. I wasn't sure exactly when it had stopped feeling like a number worth tracking. I just knew that it had. The folder was in the third drawer. I wasn't looking for it. That's the part I keep coming back to. I wasn't snooping, wasn't investigating, wasn't doing any of the things that would make the story tidier and my conscience cleaner. I was looking for a pen. Marcus had asked me to sign a form for the building management, something routine about emergency contacts. And the pen I usually kept on the kitchen counter had disappeared, and I went through 3 drawers before I found one. And the folder was sitting in the third drawer underneath a takeout menu and a spare phone charger, like it wasn't anything particular. It was everything particular. I stood in the kitchen with the pen in my hand and looked at the tab on the folder. It said October, accident report, original, not a copy, the original. The kind of document that exists in one place and means whoever has it chose to keep it closed rather than file it somewhere safe and distant. I set the pen down. I should have closed the drawer. I know that. I had agreed not to go through his things, and a drawer in a shared kitchen is a borderline case at best. But a folder labeled accident report is not ambiguous. I knew exactly what I was looking at, and I knew exactly what looking at it would cost. I opened it anyway. What was inside took me 11 minutes to read. I know because I checked my phone when I closed the folder and checked it again when I put it back. And 11 minutes had passed in which the apartment was completely silent and I was completely still. And Baltimore went on existing outside the window without any awareness that something had just shifted in the woman standing at the kitchen counter of the 14th floor penthouse on Charles Street. The accident report was from 3 years ago. A county road outside Baltimore, early November, 6:15 in the morning. Marcus's car, a model I recognize as the kind of vehicle that gets inspected regularly, serviced on schedule, maintained by people whose job is specifically to make sure nothing goes wrong, had gone off the road on a curve and hit a barrier. The initial report cited possible brake failure. The follow-up investigation, conducted by an independent mechanical firm whose name I didn't recognize, was stapled behind the original. Their findings were not ambiguous. The brake line had not failed. It had been cut. Partially, not all the way through, which would have been detectable before the car was driven, but enough that under sustained pressure, over enough distance, the line would give. It was the kind of work that required knowledge, not casual knowledge, professional knowledge. Behind the mechanical report were two other documents. The first was a series of printed email exchanges, internal Reed Capital correspondence, dated 6 weeks before the accident. Devon's name appeared in 12 of them. The subject lines ranged from restructuring timeline to board composition review to one that simply said, after. In that last one, Devon had written 4 sentences to a contact whose email domain I didn't recognize. The fourth sentence said, by Q1, he'll be out of the picture and we move forward as discussed. The second document was a photograph. Marcus, at what looked like a physical therapy facility, maybe 18 months ago, standing. Both feet on the ground, hands on parallel bars, weight fully supported, but standing. The photo had a date stamp in the bottom right corner. I closed the folder and put it back, and stood very still for a long time. Then I picked up the pen and signed the building form and put it on the counter where Marcus would see it. And I waited. He told me that evening, not because I asked. I had decided in the time between finding the folder and 6 o'clock that I was not going to confront him with what I'd seen. Not because I was afraid to, but because there is a difference between demanding a truth and creating a space where a truth can be given, and I wanted him to give it. I wanted it to come from him. We ate dinner. I had made a simple pasta, nothing elaborate, because my hand was having a harder day than usual, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. And afterward, he stayed at the island instead of moving toward his office, which he almost always did. He sat with his hands around his water glass and looked at it and didn't say anything for long enough that I started to think the moment had passed. Then he said, Devon cut my brake line. I set my fork down. 3 years ago, he said. November. I'd been driving that road every morning for 2 years. He knew the curve. He knew the grade. He knew exactly how long it would take and how fast I'd be going. He paused. He'd been planning it for at least 6 weeks. I found that out later. The emails, I said quietly. He looked at me then. I held his gaze. Neither of us said anything about the drawer. The emails, he confirmed, and the mechanical report, and about 14 other things I've spent 3 years collecting. Why haven't you gone to the police? I did. He said it flatly, immediately. And Devon's lawyers buried the inquiry in 60 days. He had board relationships, donor relationships, a PR firm and retainer. I was the older brother in a wheelchair making accusations about the man who had stepped up to keep the company running. He looked back at his glass. You know how that story gets told. I did know. I had watched enough black men and women be disbelieved by institutions that should have been paying attention to understand exactly how that story gets told. So you've been building your own case, I said. For 3 years? From this chair. He said it without self-pity, just as information, the coordinates of a situation he had been navigating with the same precision he brought to everything else. The chair was useful. Devon stopped seeing me as a threat the moment I was in it. You stop watching the person you've already beaten. I was quiet for a moment. The photo, I said, the one at the PT facility. You've been able to walk for over a year. A beat. Longer than that. Something hot moved through my chest. Not anger at him, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of realizing the room you thought you knew has a door you didn't know about. You've been hiding that too. Standing up meant Devin knew I was coming. The moment he knew, he would have moved assets, destroyed evidence, left the country if he had to. He met my eyes. I was a year and a half away from having everything I needed. I couldn't blow it. And now? Now I'm close. He paused. Close enough that Devin is nervous, which is why he came here. I thought about Devin in this apartment, the inventory behind his eyes, the way he had looked at me like a variable he was still calculating. He came to figure out what I know, I said, and what I told you, which wasn't much at that point, which is why he left without making a move. Marcus set his glass down. He'll come back. People like Devin always come back when they think there's an angle. I sat with all of that. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, rain had started against the windows. The light, persistent Baltimore rain that doesn't announce itself, just shows up and stays. Why did you need a wife? I said. Specifically, for the plan. He was quiet for a moment. The board has certain requirements for reinstating an ousted CEO. One of them is a demonstration of personal stability, a loosely written clause that Harold put in place because he'd watched 3 companies in his industry implode over family disputes. Devin used it against me 18 months ago when I first tried to move. Unmarried, disabled, no fixed personal support structure. He had his lawyers argue I was emotionally compromised. A pause. A wife changes the optics. A wife who is competent, professional, and credible in her own right changes them more. I heard that. All of it, including what was underneath it. The part he didn't say, which was that he had needed someone he could trust to hold the line. And he had sat in a hospital waiting room and watched a woman in a hand brace reading a neurosurgery journal with the focused discipline of someone who finished what she started. And he had made a calculation. I was useful, I said. You were necessary, he said. Those aren't the same thing. I looked at him. He looked back at me with the level attention that I had spent 10 weeks learning to read and still wasn't entirely sure I could. Get some rest, he said. Your hand was worse today. I could tell at dinner. He moved his chair toward the hallway. I stayed at the island. Marcus, he stopped. Thank you for telling me. A beat. Thank you for not asking me to before I was ready. He went. I sat in the kitchen and listened to the rain and thought about a man who had spent 3 years being invisible on purpose, who had looked at me in a waiting room and seen something worth calculating, and who had, at some point between then and now, started rinsing cups and leaving them on the drying rack and noticing when my hand was having a hard day. I thought about what necessary and useful meant and what the space between them looked like and whether there was something in that space that neither of us had named yet because we hadn't agreed to that part. I didn't have answers. But for the first time since I'd moved my single rolling suitcase into this apartment, I wasn't sure the 6-month timeline was a structure I wanted to live inside. Devin came back on a Thursday. Not to the apartment this time. He found me at the hospital, the outpatient clinic where I had a morning appointment for my hand assessment, a place Marcus didn't know I was going to because I had scheduled it through the PT office directly. I don't know how Devin knew. I've thought about that since, and the most likely answer is that he had been watching more carefully than I understood, for longer than I was comfortable with. He was waiting outside the clinic exit when I came out at 11, leaning against the wall in a cashmere overcoat, coffee in hand, casual as a man waiting for a bus. Zara. He smiled like we were acquaintances. How's the hand? I stopped walking. How do you know where I am? I have a lot of resources, he said. Not threatening, just truthful in the particular way of someone who wants you to understand the scope of what they have access to. Can we talk? 5 minutes. Just 2 people having a conversation. I considered walking past him. I considered calling Victor. I considered a number of things in the space of about 4 seconds. And then I decided that knowing what Devin wanted was more valuable than avoiding him. And I crossed my arms and said, "You have 3 minutes." He straightened up. The easy smile shifted into something more direct. I'll be honest with you, because I think you're smart enough to appreciate it. That's a bold opening. Marcus is building a case against me. He said it without flinching. You probably know that. I want you to know that whatever he's told you about what happened, the accident, the board, all of it, there's a version of events that's more complicated than he's presenting. I'm sure there is, I said. There usually is. He reached into his coat and took out an envelope, set it on top of the railing beside us. I'm not asking you to do anything dramatic. I'm asking you to consider that maybe the healthiest thing for you and for Marcus is a quieter resolution. The board has enough questions about his mental and physical fitness that one supporting statement from a credible source. He glanced at my hospital ID badge. Would close this quickly. You could go back to your fellowship. He could go back to his life. Nobody spends the next year in a legal war. I looked at the envelope. It was thick. I thought about the folder in the kitchen drawer, the cut break line, the email that said by Q1 he'll be out of the picture, the photograph of Marcus in the PT facility, standing on his own 2 feet, quietly rebuilding in the same careful and relentless way he did everything. I picked up the envelope, turned it over in my hands once. Then I set it back on the railing and pushed it toward him. Get out of my face, I said. Devin looked at the envelope, then at me. Something moved in his expression, not anger, closer to recalculation. The look of a man updating a formula. You don't know what you're protecting, he said. I know exactly what I'm protecting. I held his gaze. And I know what you are. So you can take that envelope and whatever comes with it and leave me alone. We're done here. I walked away. I walked the full length of the hospital corridor and into the stairwell before I stopped and put my back against the wall and let my hands shake for about 30 seconds. Because they were going to shake whether I allowed it or not. And the stairwell was private. And I have always believed in finding somewhere private for the things your body needs to do after a hard moment. Then I straightened up and went back to the car. I didn't tell Marcus right away, not because I was hiding it. I had decided very clearly that I was going to tell him, but because I needed a few hours with it first. Needed to sit with the shape of what Devin was willing to do, how far he would reach, what it meant that he had come to me directly. That evening I told Marcus everything. The location, the envelope, the exact words. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Not the processing quiet, the other kind, the kind that means something is happening under the surface that isn't ready to come up yet. Then he said, I'll have Victor increase the security on your appointments. That's not... I stopped. Okay. Zara. Yeah. Thank you. He said it the same way he said everything, level without flourish. But it landed differently than the other times, like the word was carrying more weight than it usually did, and he knew it and was letting it. Jade Monroe arrived on a Saturday morning like a storm that hadn't been on the forecast. I heard the elevator and the knocking, and not the measured knock of Victor, not the confident let himself in of Devin. Rapid, urgent, the kind of knocking that comes from someone who has been holding something in for too long and can't hold it anymore. I opened the door. Jade was in the hallway in a jacket I recognized as expensive and jeans that were slightly wrinkled in the way of someone who had gotten dressed quickly. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Her hands were in front of her, fingers twisted together, and I thought immediately of every patient I had ever seen in a waiting room trying to hold themselves together in a public space. I didn't know where else to go, she said. Her voice was different from the benefit dinner. The gold dress confidence was completely gone. What was underneath it was younger and more frightened and more real. I know you don't like me. I know, but I didn't know who else. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about the benefit dinner. Oh, that's sweet of you. The 2 degrees above genuine hug. Then I thought about my grandmother, who had a saying she applied to approximately every situation. What a person does to you is their character. What you do about it is yours. Come in, I said. She came in, sat at the kitchen island with her hands still twisted together. I put the kettle on, because that was what you did when someone showed up at your door looking like that, and I waited. I'm pregnant, she said. Devin's 3 months. I kept my face neutral. Okay. He told me it's not his. He told me he needs a paternity test before he'll acknowledge anything. And then he told me... She stopped. Her jaw worked. He told me that if I wanted any kind of support from him, I'd keep quiet about certain things I know about his family situation, his brother. I was very still. I've heard things, Jade said, over the past year, things Devin said on the phone, things he said to people when he thought I wasn't paying attention, about the accident, about why Marcus can't come after him. She looked up at me. I didn't think it mattered. I didn't want it to matter, but now... She pressed her hands flat on the counter. He's threatening me with my own pregnancy, and I need someone to know what I know. The front door opened. Devin walked in. He had a key, which told me something significant and terrible about the limits of building security when you have enough resources. He walked in and saw Jade at the island and me across from her, and the expression on his face moved through several things very quickly: surprise, anger, calculation, before it landed on something controlled and cold. Jade. His voice was careful. What are you doing here? She came to see me, I said. This doesn't concern you, Zara. She's in my home, I said. That makes it concern me. Devin crossed the room toward Jade, not aggressively, but with a purposefulness that made Jade flinch backward on the stool, and that flinch was the thing that finished whatever remaining objectivity I had left about Devin Reed. Jade, we're going to talk about this privately. She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go, I said. Devin turned to me. I told you. I heard you at the hospital, I said. And I heard you just now, and I'm telling you for the second time that you need to leave. What happened next happened fast. Devin reached past me toward Jade, not striking, not grabbing, just the reaching gesture of a man accustomed to taking up space that hadn't been offered. And I stepped sideways to put myself between them. And in the movement of that, my shoulder caught the corner of the kitchen island, and I spun, and my knee connected with the base of the stool hard, and I went down sideways. The pain was immediate and specific, not the sharp electric pain of a break, but the deep thudding impact of bone against something unforgiving. I sat on the kitchen floor with my knee pulled up and my teeth pressed together and my hand braced on the tile. The room went very quiet. And then I heard, from the direction of the hallway, a sound I had not heard in 10 weeks of living in this apartment: footsteps. Not the sound of wheels, footsteps. The sound of a person walking at speed down a hallway, weight transferring from heel to toe, in the uneven cadence of someone moving faster than their body was fully ready for. Marcus came around the corner, and he was standing. Both feet on the ground, no chair, one hand against the wall for balance, the other at his side, his face a thing I do not have exact words for. Because it was not the level, unreadable face I had spent 10 weeks cataloging, and it was not anger in any form I recognized, and it was not the cold authority of the phone calls. It was something rawer and more immediate than all of those, something that looked like fear wearing the clothes of fury. He looked at me on the floor. Then he looked at Devin. Devin had gone completely still. Whatever he had prepared himself for, whatever version of this moment he had calculated, it was not this. You could see it drain from his face in real time. The controlled expression, the resources, the certainty, all of it encountering something it had not accounted for. Get out of my house, Marcus said. His voice was quiet. That was the thing about it. It was not raised. It was the quietest voice in the room, and it was the only sound that mattered. Devin opened his mouth. Devin. Marcus took one step forward, just one, deliberate and clear. Get out. Devin left. Not with dignity, with the particular rapid exit of someone who has just had the ground shift underneath them and needs to get somewhere stable before they figure out what that means. The front door opened and closed, and the elevator was called, and then there was only the sound of Baltimore outside, and Jade's breathing, and my knee throbbing, and Marcus standing in his own kitchen, on his own 2 feet, looking at me on the floor. He crossed to me. He didn't reach for the wall this time. His gait was not fully steady. There was a slight unevenness in it, the compensation pattern of a body that had been relearning its own instructions, but it was his, and it held him. He came down to one knee in front of me with the careful, controlled movement of someone who had been practicing exactly this. Where? He said. Knee, I said. I'm okay. It's not the joint, it's just the... Let me look. He looked. His hands were steady and his touch was clinical in the same way Okafor's was. Impersonal in its purpose, present in its attention. He pressed along the kneecap, the patellar tendon, the sides of the joint. I winced at one point and he registered it and adjusted. Not structural, he said. You'll bruise. I know, I said. We were very close. He was still on one knee and I was on the floor and neither of us had moved. And the kitchen was very quiet. And I don't know how long we stayed like that before I said, how long have you been able to do this? Long enough, he said. Marcus. Longer than the photo, he said. I wanted to tell you, I should have told you sooner. When it became... He stopped. When it became what? He looked at me. The raw, unguarded thing that had been on his face when he came down the hallway was still there. Not fully, but the edges of it were still visible, like a door that hadn't fully closed. When it became something other than the plan, he said. Jade was still at the island. I had almost forgotten. She made a small sound, was not intrusive, just present. And Marcus stood and helped me up. And I stood on my good leg and tested the other carefully, and it held, sore but functional. Victor, Marcus said. To me, to the room. I need to call Victor. I know, I said. And I need to sit down. Yes. He moved toward the hallway and then stopped and looked back at me. Something traveled across his face. Now, not the practiced expressions, not the controlled register of a man who had been managing his own legibility for 3 years, just a man looking at the person in his kitchen. Zara. Yeah. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I looked at him for a moment, then I said, make me some tea and we'll talk about it. Something happened at the corner of his mouth, not almost a smile, an actual one. Brief and real and belonging to a face I realized I had never actually seen before because this was the first time he'd let it. He went to put the kettle on. That night I got the text. My phone, on the nightstand at 11:47. An unknown number, 6 words and an address. The truth about your husband. Harbor Point. Come alone. I lay there and looked at it for a long time. I knew in the rational part of my brain that had gotten me through medical school and residency and every hard thing before this, that going alone to a waterfront location at midnight, because an anonymous text told me that it was the kind of decision that ends badly in statistics. I knew that. I am a doctor. I understand probability. I also knew that Devon was escalating, and that whatever was in that text was connected to what Jade knew and what she had started to say, and that if I brought Victor or Marcus, the source would disappear and whatever was there would be gone. I thought about the folder in the drawer. I thought about the cut break line. I thought about a man on one knee in his own kitchen, his hands steady, his face finally open. I put on my coat and I left. Harbor Point at midnight was the Baltimore waterfront at its quietest. The restaurants closed, the pedestrian paths empty, the water reflecting back the lights of the city in long, trembling lines. I found the location the text specified, a bench near the south end of the promenade, where the path curved and you could see both the water and the street. A man was there. I didn't recognize him. Late 40s, unremarkable coat, the careful anonymity of someone who did not want to be remembered. He had an envelope. He held it out. I took it. Inside was a photograph. I held it up to the nearest light. Marcus, in a building I didn't recognize, the glass-fronted office tower, the kind that suggests significant occupancy, standing in a lobby, no wheelchair, his weight on both feet. Looking at something off camera, his expression the unguarded version I had seen for the first time this morning. The date stamp in the corner was 14 months ago. I lowered the photo. He can walk. My brain said it even though I had already known it, already been told it. Because knowing something as a fact and holding the photograph of it are two different kinds of knowing. He's been walking. I stood on the promenade and felt the cold off the water and tried to work out what Devon intended for me to do with this. Leave? Confront Marcus? Feel betrayed enough to give Devon the statement he had offered me an envelope for? And then my phone died. The screen went black with the completeness of a battery that had been low when I left and had run out while I was standing here, at midnight, at the waterfront, alone, with a dead phone and no way to call anyone. I looked around the promenade. The man with the envelope was gone. The path was empty in both directions. The water made its quiet harbor sounds. And then behind me, footsteps. I turned. In the penthouse on Charles Street, 14 floors up, Marcus Reed was in his office when Victor came through the door without knocking, which he had done exactly twice in the 5 years they had worked together, and both times had been significant. Victor said, "Sir, the security cameras at Harbor Point, someone took them offline 20 minutes ago." Marcus looked up from his desk. "And Zara's phone," Victor said, "is dead." The expression on Marcus's face was the one from the kitchen, the raw one, the one without the practiced distance. It lasted approximately 1 second before it became something colder and more operational, the face of a man shifting from feeling to action in the way that people do when the thing that is threatened is something they cannot afford to lose. "Find her," Marcus said. "Right now." The footsteps belonged to a security guard. Not Devon's people. A Harbor Point facilities officer doing his midnight round, flashlight sweeping the promenade, who found a woman standing alone by the water holding a photograph and looking like she was doing complex math in her head. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine, my phone was dead, and I needed to use his radio to reach someone. He looked at me for a moment, the way people look at you when the answer you've given doesn't quite match the situation you're standing in. And then he handed me his radio without argument. I didn't have Victor's number memorized. I had Marcus's. I had memorized it 3 weeks into the arrangement without deciding to. The way you memorize things that become part of the daily texture of your life before you notice they've settled in. He answered on the first ring. He didn't say anything, just present, breathing, waiting. I'm at Harbor Point, I said. South Promenade. I'm fine. My phone died. A pause that lasted maybe 4 seconds and contained something I could not fully interpret over borrowed radio in the dark. Then, stay there. Victor arrived in 11 minutes. I know because the facilities officer stayed with me and I counted, which is what I do when I need to manage the space between one moment and the next. 11 minutes, and then headlights on the promenade path, and Victor coming toward me with the measured urgency of a man who has been trained to arrive without making the situation feel worse than it already is. He looked at me, assessed. Are you hurt? No. He nodded once, the same way Marcus nodded. I had not noticed until that moment how much of Victor's manner was a reflection of the man he had worked alongside for years. Let's go. In the car, I held the photograph in my lap. Victor didn't ask about it. He drove and I sat, and the Baltimore waterfront receded behind us. And I thought about Devin's calculation, what he had expected me to do with that image, what emotional door he had been trying to open. He had expected betrayal. He had expected that seeing proof of Marcus's recovered mobility would make me feel used enough to act against him. What it had actually done was make me tired. Tired of Devin's architecture of manipulation. Tired of the way he treated people as pieces in a structure he alone was building. Tired, most specifically, of the way he had looked at Jade in my kitchen. Like she was a liability he was managing rather than a person carrying his child. I was done being tired. I wanted to be useful. Marcus was in the living room when we came in. Not the office, the living room, which I associated primarily with the formal hours. The benefit dinner departure, the occasional evening when Victor needed a space large enough for documents spread across the coffee table. Marcus sat there in the chair he had started using more often than the wheelchair in the past 2 weeks, and when I came through the door, he looked at me with the open expression, the one I had first seen that morning in the kitchen, and did not look away from it. I sat down across from him, set the photograph on the table between us. He looked at it, then at me. Devin sent someone to give me this, I said. He wanted me to feel like you've been lying to me. Like the whole arrangement was a performance. Parts of it were, Marcus said. I know that. I held his gaze. I also know that a plan and a lie are different things, even when they look the same from the outside. You had reasons. They weren't small reasons. They weren't reasons that included you, he said. Not fully. Not the way they should have. He paused. That's the part I should have handled differently. I looked at him for a moment. Victor told me once that you haven't trusted anyone in 3 years. Victor talks too much. He was right, though. Marcus was quiet. The lamp behind him cast the room in the particular amber light that I had come to associate with late evenings in this apartment. With the end of the day's formality, the hours when the apartment exhaled into something more itself. My father built Reed Capital on the premise that trust was a resource you spend carefully, he said. He wasn't wrong. In business, trust misplaced costs you time and money. I learned that lesson very well. A pause. What I did not learn, what nobody taught me, was that there are contexts where that particular lesson becomes a cage you build around yourself without noticing. I did not say anything. I let that sit. Devin knew things about me that I thought I'd kept private, Marcus continued. Things I'd told one person who told him. After the accident, when I understood what had happened, the full picture, I decided I was done giving people access to the version of myself that could be used. He looked at the photograph on the table. The wheelchair helped with that. Nobody looks at a man in a wheelchair and sees a threat. Except Devin, I said. Devin stopped looking carefully, Marcus said. He thought he'd won. People who think they've won stop paying attention. He looked at me. You didn't stop paying attention. I'm a neurosurgery resident, I said. Paying attention is the entire job. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not the full smile, the predecessor to it. Yes, he said, it is. We sat in the amber light, and I thought about 10 weeks of mornings and evenings and milk and cups left outside doors, and the specific education of learning a person in the wrong order, shape before substance, silence before words, and how that particular kind of learning, slow and accumulative and unremarkable in its individual moments, had produced in me something I hadn't agreed to and hadn't seen coming. Marcus, I said. Yeah, the 6 months. He waited. I stopped counting a while ago, I said. I don't know exactly when, but I stopped. He looked at me steadily, not with the level administrative attention of the early weeks, with the other kind, the kind that meant he was actually there, in the room, with me specifically. So did I, he said. The board meeting happened on a Thursday. 3 weeks later, I was not in the room. That had been clear from the start. This was Marcus's fight, built over 3 years, and it needed to be his to complete. But I knew the exact time it started because Victor texted me at 9:02 a.m. to say we're in, and I sat in the Hopkins outpatient clinic waiting for my hand assessment and watched the clock with the focused attention of a person who has somewhere else they urgently want to be. What I knew of what happened inside that room came from Victor afterward, and from Marcus that evening, and from the Reed Capital board, minutes that eventually became part of the public record of what followed. Marcus walked in. That was the first thing. He walked in. No wheelchair, no mobility aid, no Victor hovering at his elbow. He walked to the head of the table that had been taken from him 18 months earlier, and he sat down and he looked at Devin across the length of it. And Devin, who had been 2 years in the making of his own confidence, went still. The documentation took 40 minutes to present. 3 years of evidence, the mechanical report, the email chain, the financial irregularities Devin had committed in the intervening period, the board relationships he had cultivated with resources that were not his to use. Marcus had a lawyer, he had an independent auditor, he had, at the critical moment, one additional witness, Jade Monroe. She had called Victor 2 days after the kitchen incident. She had, in those 2 days, apparently done a great deal of thinking about what she owed Devin versus what she owed herself and the child she was carrying, and she had arrived at a conclusion that required her to say, on the record and in formal testimony prepared with her own legal counsel, what she had overheard across 14 months of being Devin Reed's partner. The phone calls, the conversations, the specific evening, 8 months ago, when Devin had told someone whose name she did not know that the accident had gone exactly as planned, and that his brother would never be in a position to challenge him. Devin's lawyers objected. Devin's lawyers had a great deal to object to, and they objected with the energy of people who had been paid substantially to do so. The board voted anyway. Devin was removed. Marcus was reinstated. The formal legal proceedings that followed, the criminal referral, the civil suits, the unwinding of 18 months of Devin's operational decisions, those took longer, as those things do. But the vote happened on a Thursday morning, and by noon it was done. Victor's text at 12:17 p.m. said only, "Done." I was in the hallway of the Hopkins clinic when I read it, and I stood there for a moment with my phone in my hand and felt something release in my chest that I hadn't fully realized I'd been holding. The sustained tension of weeks of waiting, the particular anxiety of caring about an outcome you have no direct control over. It moved through me and out, and what was left was something lighter and less complicated. My PT came out of the office and said, "Zara, we're ready for you." I put my phone in my pocket and went in. Professor Okafor told me at the end of that same week. He sat across from me at the clinic table with my most recent imaging on the screen behind him, and my hand function assessment results in front of him. And he looked at both and then at me with the manner of a man delivering information he has verified thoroughly before speaking. "The tendon repair is complete," he said. "The scar tissue has integrated well. Your grip strength is at 91% of your pre-injury baseline, which is, frankly, better than I projected at this stage." I looked at my right hand, the hand that had been on a supply cart floor 11 months ago, the hand that had cost me a rotation and a relationship and led me, through a chain of events I could not have predicted from any point along the way, to a hospital waiting room and a man with a manila folder and an offer that had seemed like the most questionable decision of my adult life. "Supervise over time," Okafor said, "starting next month. We'll build back gradually, Observation first, then assist, then primary surgeon on appropriate cases. He paused. You'll need to be patient. I know how to be patient, I said. He looked at me over his reading glasses with the specific expression of a man who has known me for almost a year. Yes, he said. I believe you do. I made dinner that night with both hands. That sounds small. It wasn't. For 11 months, I had been compensating, adjusting grip, favoring the left, finding the workarounds that become automatic so quickly you stop noticing them. Using my right hand fully, without the brace, without the conscious management of how much pressure I was applying. It was like a sound returning after a long silence, present and ordinary, and in its ordinariness, quietly significant. Marcus came out of the office at 7, which he had been doing consistently for 3 weeks. Not because I had asked him to, but because somewhere in the evolution of our evenings, 7 o'clock had become the time when the working day ended and the other part began. He saw what I was doing, both hands, full movement, and stopped in the kitchen doorway. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I set a plate in front of him and sat across the island, and we ate the way we had been eating for months, without filling the silence unnecessarily, in the comfortable efficiency of two people who had learned each other's rhythms without intending to. When he was finished, he said, "The board voted to hold a press announcement next week, reinstating my position officially, with the full context." He paused. "Read Capital will be in the news." I know. "Which means our arrangement will be in the news." I set my fork down. "Is that what you're worried about?" He looked at me. "I'm not worried about it. I want to know how you feel about it." I thought about that. About being in the news as Marcus Reed's wife, the woman who had come into this arrangement with a broken hand and a fellowship acceptance letter, and left with something considerably more complicated and considerably more real. "I'm fine with it," I said, "as long as we're telling the truth about what it became." "Which is what?" "I don't know exactly," I said, "but it's not an arrangement anymore. It stopped being that a while ago." He held my gaze for a long moment, then, "No," he said, "it stopped being that." Devon's legal situation resolved over the following months in the way that these things resolve, slowly, with lawyers, with the particular grinding machinery of institutions that move at their own pace regardless of the urgency of the people inside them. He was charged, he made bail, he spent considerable time and considerable resources contesting charges he had considerable evidence against him for, and eventually, after a process I followed from a distance through Victor's updates and the occasional news alert, he reached a plea agreement that involved the return of misappropriated assets and a period of time in a federal facility that I will not describe in detail because this story is not about Devon Reed. Devon Reed is the thing that happened. He is not what the story is about. Jade had her daughter in the spring, a girl, healthy, born at 7 pounds 4 ounces at Johns Hopkins, which I know because I was doing an observation rotation in the hospital that week and saw her name on the board. And I stopped by after my shift because she had sat in my kitchen and told the truth when it cost her something, and that seemed worth showing up for. She was in the room with her mother and a friend, and the baby was in her arms, and she looked up when I came in and something traveled across her face that wasn't the gold dress version of herself, and wasn't the frightened woman in my hallway, and was something I hadn't seen before, something quieter and more substantial. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know," I said. "She's beautiful." She looked down at her daughter. "I'm calling her Maya." I stayed for 20 minutes and then I left, and I thought about the way the same person can be both the one who mocked you at a benefit dinner and the one who handed over the evidence that helped bring down a man who had hurt your family, and how both of those things can be true simultaneously, and how the second one doesn't erase the first but does exist alongside it. People are complicated. That's not an excuse for anything. It's just geography. Marcus asked me, on a Sunday morning in late spring, whether I wanted to stay. He asked it directly, the way he did everything. No preamble, no performance, no arrangement of words designed to make the question sound smaller than it was. We were at the kitchen island with coffee and the Sunday paper that Victor had started bringing. And he set his cup down and looked at me and said, "The 6 months ended 4 months ago. I want to know if you want to stay." I looked at him for a moment, the man I had married in 11 days in a green dress in a courthouse, the man who had rinsed cups and put them on the drying rack, who had come down a hallway on his own 2 feet because I was on the floor, Who had said necessary when he meant something that required more courage to say, and had found his way to saying it over the months that followed. "Make me another cup of coffee," I said, "and I'll tell you." He picked up my cup, went to the counter, made the coffee the way I had taught him, which took longer than it needed to and was always slightly better than when I made it myself. He came back and set it in front of me and sat down and waited, because waiting was one of the things Marcus Reed did better than almost anyone I had ever known. I wrapped both hands around the cup, both hands fully without compensation, and looked at him over the rim. "I'm staying," I said. He held my gaze. "Good," he said. Just that. Not a declaration, not a ceremony. "Good." In the voice that carried more weight than it showed, from the man who had been teaching me all along that the truest things tend to be the quietest ones. "I want to say something to you before I go, because you've been here this whole time and you deserve an honest ending rather than a tidy one. I did not marry a fairy tale. I married a man with a complicated plan and a 3-year wound and a capacity for stillness that initially read as coldness and turned out to be something else entirely. I married into a situation that had sharp edges I could not see from the outside. And I got cut by some of them, and I cut myself on a few others by going places I had been warned not to go and making choices that were not entirely rational. My hand works. That still gets me sometimes. The simple functional miracle of it. I am 3 months into supervised OR time with Okafor's program, and last week I assisted on a pediatric spinal case that took 4 hours and required steadiness I was not sure 11 months ago I would ever have back. I had it, both hands, full grip, steady. What I know now that I didn't know when I signed my name in a courthouse in a green dress is that the things that actually change your life rarely announce themselves. They arrive as inconveniences or accidents or offers you'd be rational to refuse. They arrive at the wrong time, from unexpected directions, asking you to be braver or more patient or more present than you planned to be that particular day. You don't see them for what they are until you're already inside them. If this story found something in you, if you've ever stayed in a situation everyone told you to leave, or trusted someone before you had all the information, or gotten up off a kitchen floor and kept going, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you're in the middle of right now that you can't see the end of yet. And if you're new here, pull up a chair. Every story I tell is true. Every single one of them cost something to live. And every one of them, in the end, was worth it.